Look at this 1960s Patek Calatrava. If I would ask you what is the most beautiful part of this watch, you would probably point to the dial. Or maybe the white gold case. But you would be wrong. Because the most beautiful part of this piece was never meant to be seen. It is the movement. So if I asked you what luxury really means, I think the most people would probably give a very similar answer. They would talk about precious metals, complicated movements, or famous names. Maybe they would picture a watch covered in diamonds, or something so rare that only a handful of people in the world could ever own it. But I have always thought that true luxury looks very different. To me, luxury is when somebody spends an extraordinary amount of time perfecting something that almost nobody ever will notice. And I can't think of many watches that explain that idea better than this one. This is a Patek Philippe Calatrava, reference 3445 from the 1960s. Crafted in 18-karat white gold, measuring a beautifully balanced 35 millimeter, it looks exactly what a classic dress watch should look like. The dial is clean. The proportions are elegant. And nothing about it is trying to compete for attention. In fact, if you didn't know this was a Patek Philippe, you could easily walk straight past it. And that's exactly what makes it so interesting. Because the real masterpiece isn't sitting on the outside. It is hiding underneath the caseback. When people first discover vintage Patek Philippe, they often expect every watch to be loud in one way or another. They expect complicated dials, perpetual calendars, or something that immediately announces itself as special. But that's never really been the philosophy behind the Calatrava. The Calatrava has always been about restraint. It is about taking away everything that doesn't need to be there until all you are left with is perfect proportion, perfect balance, and perfect execution. And I think this reference captures that philosophy beautifully. Everything about it feels incredibly deliberate. The long, slender hour markers create a wonderful sense of space across a dial. The small seconds adds just enough visual weight to balance the date window. And even the crown has recessed slightly into the case, so that it doesn't interrupt the clear silhouette any more than absolutely necessary. None of those decisions change the way the watch tells the time. They simply make it a little more beautiful to live with. Then you start looking at the case a little more closely. And this is where the watch begins revealing details that most people completely miss. At first glance, it almost looks like a traditional polished white gold case. But the moment you move it through the light, you realize that the entire character of the watch changes. That's because Patek finished the step bezel and the integrated bracelet using what's known as Florentine finishing. Instead of leaving the gold perfectly smooth, thousands of incredibly fine intersecting cuts have been applied by hand, creating a surface that almost seems to soften the light rather than reflecting it. It is very difficult to describe until you see it in person, because the watch never sparkles in an obvious way. Instead, it has this quiet glow that changes every time you move your wrist and gives the entire watch a warmth that polished gold simply doesn't have. The funny thing is that many people looking at this watch would never even realize that finish is there. And yet somebody at Patek Philippe still decided it was worth doing. I think That's a beautiful way of looking at craftsmanship. But as much as I admire the case, that's still not my favorite part of this watch. Because everything we've looked at so far was always meant to be seen. The movement wasn't. Back in the 1960s, nobody had sapphire casebacks. Owners didn't spend their evenings turning watches over to admire the movement, because once the watch was closed, it simply disappeared. Which makes the movement inside this Calatrava even more remarkable. This is the legendary Patek Philippe Calibre 27460M, one of the manufacturer's defining automatic movements, and a direct descendant of the caliber that powered the legendary reference 2526. Even today, collectors consider it one of the finest automatic movements Patek Philippe ever made. Not only because it's technically excellent, but because every single component reflects an extraordinary level of care. The bridges have been beautifully beveled by hand. The Geneva stripes flow elegantly across the movement. Every screw has been polished. Every edge has been finished. And the more time you spend looking at it, the more you begin to realize that nothing inside this movement exists by accident. It almost feels like as so the movement was built to satisfy the watchmaker rather than the customer. And then your eyes naturally arrive at the rotor. It's made from solid gold. And while many people assume that is simply because of gold feels luxurious, the truth is actually much more interesting. Gold is considerably denser than brass, which means the additional weight allows the rotor to wind the movement more efficiently with less effort. In other words, there is a genuine engineering reason for using solid gold here. But that's only half the story, because Patek Philippe didn't stop once the engineering was solved. They engraved the rotor so beautifully. They finished every visible surface with exactly the same level of care as the rest of the movement, even though they knew very few owners would ever remove the caseback to admire it. And I think that's one of the defining differences between craftsmanship and luxury. Luxury often focuses on the things everybody else can see. Craftsmanship focuses just as much on the things that nobody sees at all. The more vintage watches I handle, the more I find myself appreciating that way of thinking. We live in a world where almost everything competes for attention. Bigger logos, louder designs, and more complicated dials have somehow become the definition of luxury. But this watch reminds me that it doesn't have to be that way. Nothing of this Calatrava asks you to notice it. It simply rewards the people who do. And perhaps that's exactly why it has aged so beautifully over the last 60 years. Because true craftsmanship was never designed to impress strangers. It was designed to satisfy the people who created it. And when you hold a watch like this in your hands, I think you can still feel that philosophy today. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for watching and hope to see you again in the next video.